Have you ever stopped to think about the lengths a man will go to hide his true self? I've often thought about it. Pretending always seemed easier than facing the price of being who I am. On the outside, I was the picture of stability. 48 years old, married to Helena for over 2 decades, 2 children, a comfortable home, a job that supported everything. To the neighbors, I was a role model. At work, a decent man. At home, a present husband, albeit distant in some silences. What no one saw was that restrained smile concealed an old secret. Born in my youth, even before I met Helena. I'll go back to the beginning. I was 20 when I met Daniel. He arrived at places with a light of his own. He joked, laughed, and filled the air as if he had always been allowed to exist. I was the opposite, shy, reserved, trained from an early age to hide any gesture that might reveal my feelings. At a college party, he approached me lightly and offered me a beer. He said that this might be our only chance to talk. That simple sentence broke through my defenses. We left the party and talked until dawn. There was nothing but words, but I felt something I had never felt before, the sensation of being truly seen. Days of secret meetings followed, aimless car rides, long conversations on park benches, hands that touched for a second and then pulled away. What I felt grew silently. At the same time, the pressure also grew. At home, my father would repeat that a man is proven by what he builds, wife, children, work. He said the rest was a waste. I listened and shrank. Daniel, on the other hand, spoke of the future as if gazing at his own horizon. He said we could live together. I said it wasn't simple. He replied that sometimes what's missing isn't simplicity, it's courage. I avoided the conversation with excuses, but it lingered. It was then that I met Helena, sweet, practical, enchanted by my seriousness. Within a few months we were engaged. The wedding was celebrated as a family triumph. I smiled in the photos, hugged relatives, thanked friends. Inside, something inside me was buried. Outside the church, Daniel saw me from afar. He wasn't invited. Our eyes met for a moment, and it was like a shock. I didn't tell anyone about it. I moved on, or at least I tried. The years passed, and Helena always noticed a hint of melancholy in my gaze. I was there, but a part of me remained distant. Even married, I couldn't erase Daniel from my memory. All I had to do was hear a song on the radio, smell a perfume on the street, find an old shirt in the back of the closet, and it all came flooding back. I told myself it was just nostalgia, until fate brought me face to face with him again. The reunion happened by chance, and the moment I saw him I realized nothing had been erased. He was more mature, more confident. He asked me with his eyes if I thought I could run away forever. All I could admit was that I had tried, and failed. From that moment on, my life began to unravel. We sat in a discreet bar and spoke in short, paused sentences. He said I had changed, but that my eyes were the same. I said he seemed stronger. He corrected me. He said it wasn't strength, it was fatigue, tired of running, of hiding, of pretending. As I listened, old scenes flashed through my mind. The first walk on campus, the late-night conversations, the hurried kiss on a dark street, the knowing laughter that only we two understood. I felt once again the impact of being seen. On the way out, we walked down the nearly empty street. I told her I'd tried every way to forget him, but he always came back. He replied that he'd never left. It was I who had left, when I closed the door of my life to what I felt. What happened next was inevitable. The kiss came urgently, with anger at lost time, with the strength of years held back. I returned home, splitting in two. Helena was asleep, the boys too. I lay beside her, and lay with my eyes open in the darkness, listening to the question Daniel dressed up as a truth. Do you think you have more time? In the days that followed, I tried to convince myself it was just a reunion, that I could handle it, that it would be enough to just keep busy with work and routine. I lied to myself. With every message from Daniel, every call, every excuse I made to leave the house, I found myself more deeply embedded in that second life. By day, I was the righteous husband. By night, the man reborn in desire and fear. I began to live in 2 realities. In one I breathed, in the other I drowned in silence. Perhaps you who are listening to me know this feeling. Your heart races for someone you can't assume, the weight of a perfect social role, and underneath, the desire to exist as you are. That's why I'm telling you this story bluntly. If this beginning touched you, leave a comment. It could be courage, it could be truth. This simple gesture shows me that this narrative has reached you and helps bring this conversation to those who need to hear it. And if this content resonates with you, please like and subscribe. This keeps this space alive and allows me to continue bringing stories that transform silence into presence. Stay with me, because what comes next will only become more intense. Over time, my encounters with Daniel became more frequent and riskier. I invented work trips, meetings, technical visits. I heard my own lies so many times that I began to believe them. Helena felt it. She didn't say anything, but the house took on a painful air of waiting. I avoided her gaze. Covering up my fatigue served for everything. At the same time, Daniel began to demand what I didn't have the courage to give. He said he wouldn't accept being my break between lies. He asked for my presence, my future, my name. I replied that he was already part of my life. He reminded me that it was still a secret. That hurt more than any outside judgment. I collected symbols of a hidden life, a photo of us tucked away in a book, a perfume that lingered on my shirt, a cheap room key stubbornly forgotten. Each object was a reminder of what I was trying to experience in the cracks of the day. The price was getting high. The fear, which had always been with me, turned into anxiety. I started looking over my shoulder at every corner. At work, I lost focus. At home, I became an expert at dodging the subject. And behind it all, a question surrounded me on all sides. How long? How long would the boys see half of their father? How long would Helena pretend not to notice? How long would Daniel accept crumbs? Time, relentless, pushed everything to its limit. At my family's table, I still heard the old script. My mother would repeat how lucky I was to have a wife like Helena. My father would declare that a man's respect comes from family. I nodded, trapped in a chair that no longer fit me. The phrases from childhood still held power, but I could no longer obey them. I felt a rupture was inevitable. Everywhere I looked, there was loss. If I chose love, I would risk the world's judgment. If I chose role, I would lose myself forever. It was like walking a tightrope stretched across two chasms. I didn't know how to take a definitive step at that moment. I did what I always did. I pushed with my gut. But life is patient, but not infinite. One day the rope gave way, and when it gives way, the body learns to fall as it will, or learns to rise with what's left. The rope gave way on a night that started out ordinary. Helena was cutting fruit in the kitchen when my phone vibrated on the table. I was in the shower. She saw the screen light up and read a short preview with the time and a door number. There was no scene there. There was only a new silence, the kind that moves furniture without pushing anything. When I got out of the shower, I found a smile that wasn't a smile. It was a warning wave. I got dressed, invented a meeting that didn't exist, and left. She waited a few minutes and left too. Later, I learned that she parked 2 blocks from the address, that she observed the discreet facade, that she entered from the side as if treading on familiar ground, that she looked in the elevator mirror and didn't recognize her own face. At 6 o'clock sharp, the door opened and Daniel came out first. He walked past her without noticing. I appeared soon after, adjusting my collar with the guilty haste of someone in hiding. When I saw her, my entire body froze. I went down the elevator with her without saying anything. We drove home in silence. I felt the entire car turn into an interrogation room. Inside, on the dinner table, Helena slowly placed the ring, the note with the room number, and that old key she had found months before and kept hidden like someone who keeps a question. There was no shouting, there was precision. She wanted the truth without the fuss. I tried to offer work fatigue. She returned presence. For the first time, I understood there was no longer room for my school. Theatre. I told him his name. I said it hadn't started that night. I said my cowardice was as old as my fear. She went to the bookshelf, picked up an old book, and opened it to a dedication I knew. There was no need to complain. Just placing the sentence in front of me made me see the thread I'd been following since I was 20. She didn't ask me to leave home. She simply asked me to escape the labyrinth. She asked how I intended to do that. She asked for order, deadlines, assumed losses, and my name written in full. I felt the time had come to stop explaining myself and start writing to myself. The doorbell rang. When I opened the door, Daniel was there, tired, unassuming. He hadn't come to fight. He'd come to listen. The scene wasn't like a soap opera, it was like life. The 3 of us sat down. I placed myself at the center of what I'd created. I said I loved Daniel and Helena the wrong way, full of retreat and fear. I knew that wrong love leads to hurt. They understood the phrase. Differently, but they understood. Helena then proposed a concrete beginning. The next day I would go to the school meeting with her because the life of a father doesn't pause, and that night I would write, without poetry, my real plan. I grabbed a pen and paper. I wanted to write a plan, but the word that came out was truth. I jotted down steps in simple lines. Talk to the boys without delay. Inform my family, not through third parties but with my own words. Seek therapy and treat fear as fear, not morality. Arrange the separation with respect, without shortcuts that tear the children apart. Talk at work about exposure and consequences. Accept Daniel from the shadows. When I reached the line that said parents, my hand trembled. I didn't cross it out. I left the writing crooked, a mark of its weight. The next day at school, the coordinator asked if everything was okay. Helena replied that we were reorganizing the family. I heard that sentence and felt, for the first time, that a truth spoken in a simple voice has the power to establish a foundation. That night I called the boys into the living room. I placed the ring, the book with the dedication, and the piece of paper with the word truth on the sofa. I spoke without speech. I said that their mother and I were going to change our way of being a family. I told them who I am in this change. The oldest asked if I was going to leave home. Helena asked me to stay. I said I love a man. I said I hid it out of fear, not of them, but of the world and of myself. They remained silent. There was no despair. There was fright. The oldest asked me not to lie anymore. The youngest leaned on his mother's arm. I promised presence. Presence is the opposite of disappearance. At work, the manager wanted to know about exposure. He talked about customers and shop windows. I said that performance isn't afraid of light. He responded with, let's follow along. I understood the code, but I didn't accept the leash. I left the room feeling lighter on the inside and heavier on the outside. At the same time, messages circulated in neighborhood groups. A photo of me with Daniel in a store aisle became the subject of a doorman's conversation. The predictable attack followed. Then came the unexpected defense from people I didn't even know. Helena recorded a short audio message in the mother's group saying that at home we work with honesty and that the boys were doing well. I was proud of her. The world fits more than one kind of courage. I went to my parents' house. My father welcomed me with the strength of his surname. He said I could solve everything by saying it was a misunderstanding. I said no. I said that lies tear families apart. My mother cried carefully, as if afraid to make a noise. Then we went up to the attic. My father showed me an old photo with an initial on the back. M. He said a name. Mario. I realized that my father also learned to survive in silence, and that the stone I felt in him might have been born from the blow he took in his youth. I saw that my story didn't live alone. I recognized in his silence the map of my own. We returned to the kitchen, and Daniel was washing dishes next to my mother. My father looked at me and, instead of kicking me out, offered me lunch. At some point he mentioned that on Sunday they would have chicken with farofa. He didn't say come, but the phrase was a mischievous invitation. When we left, my mother wrapped a cake and put a jar of jam in the bag. My father gave me an envelope with old letters and newspaper clippings. He said it wasn't an inheritance, it was a warning. I understood. Life had left a lot of people out of the picture. Mine didn't need to be cut again. On the way back, I stopped at the market with Daniel to buy simple things for the apartment I'd rented. Dish towels, a drainer, light bulbs. We exchanged sidelong glances and a low comment that reeked of disgust. I felt the old urge to shrink. Instead, I took a deep breath and continued. I put the groceries in the trunk as if practicing a new gesture. We arrived home and I noticed the house already had a different air. It wasn't comfort. It was bare. Helena came over that night to arrange the boys' schedule. She looked at me and told me I was keeping my promise. She said she still needed to talk to me even when no one was looking. I replied that I'd started that morning. The next day, I received a call from an unknown number. It was Mario's brother. He said he had letters hidden away and wanted to hand them over to me. I felt my father's story shift within me, not to alleviate guilt, but to give context to the fear. When I hung up, Daniel asked me with his eyes if I was okay. I said yes, and that for the first time I was living without a hiding place. He smiled a little. He said that a home is built little by little. I agreed. We went to make coffee. If you're with me this far, please share a word in the comments. It could be courage, it could be presence. This simple gesture helps spread the word to those who need to hear that life improves when the truth comes out. If this story resonates with you, please like and subscribe. This is how you support this space and help me continue telling stories that lift the burden of silence. In the days that followed, the new house became filled with unfamiliar sounds. The noise from the hallway in the morning, the bread vendor's horn, the neighbor taking out the trash at 9 o'clock sharp. Daniel and I began to map these sounds like someone learning to listen to a language. At the same time, I felt the old language of fear trying to return. It was as if a hand was pulling me back every time I thought about telling someone another part of the story. I wrote down on the actual paper what I had already done and what remained to be done, as if the paper itself were a bridge between what I had promised and what I still owed myself. The call from Mario's brother kept spinning in my head. I arranged to meet him at a simple bakery, the kind that smells of filtered coffee and baking bread. I arrived early. The man had the same chin as my father, but his gaze was lighter. He placed an envelope on the table and said those letters were pieces of a time that couldn't be hidden. I opened it carefully. I read short sentences about fishing in the late afternoon, about laughter that needed to fit in the shadows, about two people trying to exist without a name. I felt a tightness that wasn't just my father's. It was mine too. At one point he wrote that laughter without an owner is freedom. I stood there holding the page and understood why my father's voice hardened the day I told him who I was. The man beside me spoke bluntly. He said he didn't want to reopen wounds, he just wanted to restore memories. I thanked him. I left the bakery with a gift and a responsibility. I returned to the apartment and placed the letters on the table. Daniel read them silently. Then he said that courage is a legacy that can be reclaimed when one chooses. I nodded. That same night, I wrote a short letter to my father. It wasn't a demand, it was an invitation. I said I wanted to show him something that could soothe the hardness in his eyes. I told him I would bring the letters on Sunday if he wanted. I pressed send and felt my heart beat with a strange rhythm. The phone responded with a message that fit entirely on one line. Bring it. At work, the adjustments officially arrived. I was reassigned to a less visible team. It didn't feel like a clear punishment, but the message was there. I decided I wouldn't waste energy trying to guess the intention. I would spend energy delivering what was my due. The newest analyst, the same one from the elevator, stopped by my desk and asked if I wanted help with the transition. I accepted. We worked side by side for hours. Late in the afternoon, she told me she had a brother and that she knew how the word truth changes a house. I smiled openly. She said that change hurts like a muscle being reused. She understood. At home, my routine with Daniel began to take shape. We shared coffee, a shopping list on the fridge door, and the habit of asking each other how their day was without fear of the answer. Sometimes we fought over trivial matters, the place of the towel, dinner time, my habit of retreating when the conversation veered into the past. He said he loved all of me, including the parts that still hid. I replied that I was relearning to be centered in my own body when the world was watching. After each friction, there came a gentle pause, as if our own home also needed silence to settle its furniture. With Helena, the logistics of separation became a map and a calendar. We sat down one afternoon to divide weeks, holidays, appointments, school meetings. She brought a practical calm that I came to admire in a new way. At one point, she stopped and said that respect isn't a feeling, it's repeated practice. That stuck. I repeated it to myself like someone memorizing a new address. When I left the old house that night, the boys came down to the gate with me. The oldest asked if he could come see the apartment on Saturday. I said yes, that there was a window with street noise and cake from the bakery on the corner. The youngest wanted to know if he could bring the strollers. I said the house was theirs too. The neighbors, like any neighborhood, had different voices. The man in the cap remained kind. He greeted me in the elevator and asked about work without a second glance. Others looked away. Some whispered. One day, a note appeared under the door. It was from a resident on the 3rd floor. She wrote that she saw photos in the group and that she wasn't there to judge. She simply wanted to say that her teenage son was confused and that maybe a coffee would help. I took a deep breath and responded carefully. I said I don't have a prescription, but I do have a listening ear. We arranged to talk. When life opens windows you didn't expect, it's best not to close them for fear of the wind. In therapy, I began to clearly name my fears. I spoke of the boy who learned to fit in, the young man who thought marriage would be a cover, the adult who finally chose to take off the cover and show off. The therapist sometimes asked me to describe scenes in detail, like the sound of my parents' gate, the light in the motel hallway, the texture of the paper with the letters. I realized that truth also resides in the small sounds. In one session, she asked me how my body reacted when I held Daniel's hand in public. I said my chest tightened, and yet I didn't let go. She smiled and said that courage is measured in repeated seconds. I kept the phrase like someone who keeps a tool. Saturday arrived and the boys came to see the new house. We opened boxes together. The youngest chose a shelf for the cars. The oldest wanted to set up the table with Daniel and laughed when the key fell through the top. I watched them both and felt a simple joy, the kind that needs no explanation. We went to the bakery. The clerk looked at Daniel and me as if doing math, but simply asked if we wanted juice or coffee. The youngest chose hot chocolate and got his mustache dirty. It was a common sight. I wished life would use that word more often for us. Common. On Sunday, I took the letters to my father. He greeted me with the same stiffness as always, but the hand holding the envelope trembled a little. We sat. He read slowly. At one point, he stopped and pressed his palm to his eyes. I remained silent. My mother, from the doorway, breathed as if easing an old pain. When he finished, he simply said it was late for certain conversations, but that he didn't want to miss them. I told him that the time left was still time. He asked me if Daniel would come to the next lunch. I said yes, if he was welcome. He took a second longer than before to agree. It was the second longest of my year. That same weekend, the street group reignited with nasty comments. Someone forwarded the grocery store photo with a text calling me a disgrace to the neighborhood. I took a deep breath and left my phone on the table. Helena sent a message that served as a shield. She wrote to the school group saying that gossip doesn't raise children, presence does. Then, the man in the cap posted a simple sentence in the building group. Welcome. If you need sugar, 302. The silence. After that was the best kind of silence, the kind that shortens the distance between doors. At work, the new team began to thrive. I discovered that my talent for problem-solving was precisely because I had spent years managing mazes. I knew how to untangle knots without breaking any wires. One afternoon, a client's director called me in for a chat. I was ready for the tricky question. She talked about deadlines, costs, and finally said she'd seen my name circulating in the industry's rumor mill, and that what mattered there was delivery and respect. I thanked her. I left the room with a rare feeling. There's more to the world than my trained mind imagines. That night, Daniel and I celebrated with something small. We had coffee on the porch. I read aloud an excerpt from one of Mario's letters, the one about laughter without an owner. Daniel rested his head on my shoulder and said that laughter with a name is also freedom. I understood. All my life, I'd wanted to be unseen so I wouldn't be hurt. Now I wanted to be seen so I could exist whole. In the darkness of the street, a dog barked, a boy laughed, a motorcycle passed. The night wasn't silence, it was companionship. As I lay down, I thought about all the conversations that still awaited me. With the boys, about friendship and respect. With Helena, about the next stages of the separation and about new homes to accommodate dates and memories. With my father, about the cropped photo and a Sunday with chicken and laughter that didn't need to be hidden. With myself, about the patience to not turn every step into a test. Truth doesn't require shows, it demands constancy. If you recognize yourself in any part of this journey, tell me in the comments with a single word. It could be presence, it could be a path. This simple gesture helps bring the story to those who still need a boost of courage. If this story resonated with you, please like and subscribe now. This is how you keep this space alive and help others breathe outside the silence. The following week, I started testing something my therapist had asked me to do. Take my place without asking permission. It wasn't about making a speech in the hallway or challenging strangers. It was something smaller and more difficult, getting to places in one piece. At the grocery store, I didn't look away when someone stared. On the street, I walked hand in hand with Daniel, walking at a normal pace, neither hurried nor slow. At work, I responded calmly when someone made a bad joke without clashing, but without laughing along. The result was curious. Reality didn't become a sea of affection. There were whispers and ugly faces, but there were also spaces that opened silently, like poorly opened doors that reveal themselves when we stop walking sideways. With the boys, I wanted to build a routine that didn't feel like a visit. I arranged to pick them up from school twice a week. On the way back, we stopped at a small square. The youngest chased pigeons. The oldest told me about a science project. I listened and responded without offering ready-made solutions. I discovered that being a father now was much less about acting and much more about showing up. When they both came to sleep over at the apartment for the first time, we went to the neighborhood market together. They chose cereal, I chose fruit. Daniel chose pasta. The night ended with a crazy pillow fight and a whispered conversation in the hallway about fear of the dark and burned out light bulbs. I realized the new house was starting to have a memory. My relationship with Helena took on a new dimension. We continued to talk about calendars, doctors, and school, but we also exchanged short messages about simple things. She sent me a photo of Pedro reading, saying he was trying to understand how letters fit together and become the world. I replied with a photo of the notebook, where I wrote the word truth for the first time without trembling. One afternoon, her lawyer asked for documents. I rushed through them without pushing deadlines. Helena noticed and said that respect is also important and that we honor agreements without pretense. I agreed. We were learning not to use each other as instruments of guilt. In the midst of all this, the neighborhood created another wave of rumors. Someone posted in the group that I'd been fired because of my lifestyle. It wasn't true. Before I could decide whether to respond, the client's director publicly wrote that my job remained the same and that gossip doesn't pay bills. I breathed a sigh of relief and sent her a direct thank you, without explaining too much. The man in the hat returned with his classic message, "If you need any sugar, 3 out of 2. I felt that small, silent alliances can save entire days. The encounter with Mario's brother continued to resonate. He sent me another message with 3 old photos. In one of them, my father appeared with the hem of his pants wet, laughing with a lightness I'd never seen before. The caption was a faintly drawn M. I took the photos to my father on Sunday. He took a moment to look at them. When he did, he said nothing for several seconds. Then he blurted out a simple sentence. We laughed the same way. I understood that for the first time, my father was seeing himself in me in a way that wasn't just painful. My mother made coffee, put the pumpkin pie on the table, and asked about the grandchildren's calendar. Life settled on the edge of the plate. In therapy, I worked on a point that was holding me back without me realizing it. The habit of apologizing for existing. I wrote down phrases I'd said without thinking. Sorry to bother you, just a minute. No need to worry. The therapist asked me to change them to others. Thank you for listening to me. I need time. I deserve to be here. At first it seemed presumptuous. After a week, it became breathing. I noticed the change when, in a meeting, a colleague tried to cut me off mid-sentence. Instead of shutting me up, I said I'd finish my argument and then listen to his. No one died. The conversation continued. Small things move big things. With Daniel, our relationship evolved in its own way. He's a child of noise and people. I'm a child of silence and barriers. When he felt like inviting friends over for dinner, I froze. I thought the neighbors would comment, that the street would hear, that the world would come in through the window. He hugged me and said the house would always be ours, never a trench. We agreed to a short, quiet date with 2 couples. We laughed in the kitchen, burned toast, and talked about silly movies. I discovered that ordinary happiness is the most revolutionary thing I've ever experienced. After they left, I sat on the floor and cried silently. It wasn't pain. It was old relief leaving my body. There was also a scare. On the way back from a movie theater, a boy passed us and said something foul. Reflexively, I let go of Daniel's hand. 2 steps later, I realized it. I went back and grabbed it again. My chest was pounding, my stomach was cold, but I didn't let go. The boy wasn't even looking. I lay in bed that night, my body aflame with fear and courage at the same time. I told him this in therapy. The psychologist said that courage doesn't erase fear, it displaces it. I repeated the phrase like someone learning to pray. Little by little, the boys got used to the new map. The oldest asked me if he could invite a friend over for a sleepover. I said yes, as long as we talked to his mom first. He told his friend that I lived with Daniel. The boy replied that he wanted to know if there were video games. I laughed. Real life is sometimes simple like that. The youngest wanted to stick a drawing of 3 people, 2 houses and 2 hearts on top of my room. He said it was so no one would forget. I promised we wouldn't forget. At work, the new team clicked. The elevator analyst and I teamed up on a difficult project. On a busy day, she opened up about her brother, something she hadn't yet told me at home. I told her that everyone has their own time and that forcing things can hurt. I also said that when the time comes, having a sincere person by your side changes everything. She smiled and replied that I was being that person. I returned home feeling light. I told Daniel. He said I was learning to use my story as a beacon, not as armor. I liked the image. As I reach the end of this passage, I realize how small gestures bring life back to the body. Stop apologizing for existing, keeping promises without turning each task into penance, laughing in the kitchen with true friends, publicly thanking those who defend you without the spotlight, showing old letters to a father who had to be turned to stone and yet kept a smile within the stone, choosing day after day not to let go. If at any point in this story you recognized yourself, tell me in the comments with a word. It could be a place. It could be whole. This simple gesture helps. Bring this story to those who still walk with their heads down. And if this video did you good, please like and subscribe now. That's how you sustain this space and help others breathe outside the silence. In the week when routine seemed to be taking root, a dormant thread awoke. Daniel told me his mother wanted to meet me. He spoke simply, but I felt the weight of the invitation. I'd been practicing my courage on the street, at work, with my father. I needed to face the mirror of the one who raised the man I love. We arrived on a Saturday afternoon, a yard filled with plants and the scent of cake. She welcomed me with attentive eyes and a steady hand. She spoke little at first. Then she asked what I was afraid of. I answered bluntly, of failing again, of becoming a shadow within my own life. She nodded and said that Daniel had always been a sunny boy, but that even the sun needs a roof when it rains. I understood the message. It's not enough to love. You have to learn to offer shelter. With the boys, logistics became a living experience. I went to the school performance rehearsal. The teacher organized the parents into rows, and Helena and I stood side by side. I felt the audience watching us as if trying to predict a fight. The performance began, and the youngest looked me over. I raised my hand, he smiled, and followed the music. At the end, a mother approached and said she admired our calm. Another bit back and changed the subject. Leaving, Pedro asked if Daniel would join us for pastel. I looked at Helena. She said, "Let's all go." We sat at the same table, 4 napkins, a shared juice, and few certainties. Still, there was a possible sense of calm. At work, the team change made it clear I'd gone from the showcase to the basement. Less glamorous project, more maintenance work. I could have interpreted it as punishment. I preferred to call it a breather. Without the spotlight, I managed to deliver a strong report to the elevator analyst. She told me her brother wanted to drop out of college after a homophobic joke in class. I wrote to him carefully that courage also means resting and then returning. I didn't offer stage advice. I just said that being alive was enough of a political act on a bad day. The city, stubborn, kept talking about us. A short video appeared on a neighborhood profile. Daniel and I holding hands at the market. The comments came in droves. There were insults. There were unfunny jokes. But there was also defense. The man in the cap wrote, "Let others live." The client director appreciated the defense and deleted 2 attacks. There was no cinematic happy ending. But with each lucid response, my body learned to stand up. At home, I told the boys about the video without embellishment. I said that adults are also targets of big kids. The oldest said he preferred it when his father was the target of the dog's sneeze. I laughed. Laughter still heals. One Sunday, my father showed up at the apartment unannounced. He carried a bag of tools and an old-fashioned apology. The neighbor from 302 saw us in the hallway and offered a drill. We went inside, and my father saw the post-it note on the fridge with the children's calendar. He read it silently. He asked about work, about rent, about the oven that was baking crookedly. I could tell he was edging closer to the edge of practical life. When he left, he stopped at the door and said the following Sunday would be chicken with farofa, and that, if I wanted, I could bring Daniel. I did. He served my mother first, then the grandchildren, then Daniel, and finally himself. It wasn't a soap opera acceptance. It was a gesture of peace. Not everything was smooth sailing. Daniel and I had a huge fight on a Wednesday night. A small matter, a tired body, an old fear in new guise. I wanted less exposure. He wanted less censorship. The fight ended in silence and the bedroom door closed. The next day, while washing dishes, I realized what was hurting me. I still treated love as something that could be taken away if I made a mistake. I called Daniel out to the balcony and told him about my fear, not to justify it, but to hold myself accountable. He said he didn't want a hero. He wanted a partner. I proposed a practical pact. One day a month would be a day to check what hurt and what healed. We wrote it down on a piece of paper and stuck it on the fridge. It works like a vaccine. Therapy offered another key. Fear doesn't go away with speeches. It goes away with the repetition of new gestures. The psychologist asked me to list scenes in which my body shrank without me noticing. I wrote, when someone laughs loudly behind me on the street, when a message arrives from the family group, when I see a photo of men being beaten. For each scene, I proposed a simple movement. Breathe slowly. Respond only when I want to. Donate money to an NGO that supports people. I wasn't going to save the world, but it was my way of regaining agency when the spiral called. I started running early in the morning, not to become an athlete, but to regulate the noise. Daniel accompanied me for the first 2 weeks and then continued sleeping, laughing at my old watch. One day of light rain, I realized I was no longer looking around for witnesses. I just ran. I stopped at the park and sent a photo to the boys with the silly caption of a dad having fun. The youngest responded with a stick figure drawing of a running man. The oldest wrote, "Dad, save your breath for Saturday's game." I saved it. There was also a conversation I owed Helena. I asked to speak without paper on the table. I thanked her for maintaining a dignified space where it was easy to turn into a war. She said that learning about my father's M had made her think about lives that die before we say goodbye. We agreed on something important. Each of us had the right to try to be happy without asking the other for permission, as long as the children were the priority. It wasn't a fairy tale promise. It was an agreement between grown-ups. When Chicken with Farofa Day arrived again, my father told half a story, and for the first time, I didn't demand the other half. I was understanding that each person has their own level of pain. At coffee time, my mother handed Helena a jar of pumpkin jam. It seemed like a small gesture. It was a bridge. Daniel washed the cups and left the kitchen the way my mother likes. She noticed. She fell silent in gratitude. I kept that close to my heart. Today, looking at the path, I see fewer fires and more good embers. Peace has a simple face. It's a father who learns slowly, and 2 boys who grow up without the burden of secrets, and a woman who built an honest way out, and a love that seeks routine, not just fire. If any scene here touched you, write to me in the comments with a word. It could be a path. It could be shelter. And if this video strengthened you, please like and subscribe now. That way, you'll help this story reach more people who need a push to emerge from the shadows. On Monday morning, a message changed the tone of the week. Mario's brother wrote that the letters were ready for us to receive. I read slowly, like someone approaching an ancient bridge. I arranged to meet the man at a simple house with a dirt garden and a chair on the sidewalk. Daniel wanted to go with me. I wanted him to go. When we arrived, the man opened the door with a calmness that seemed like he'd walked through a flood. He looked at me, then at Daniel, and said he'd kept those letters out of respect for what he hadn't been able to say in life. We sat down. The letters were on yellow paper and short phrases. There was a fishing message, a movie date, a line that said, "Laughing together was the only safe place." I recognized my father in the ellipsis. Mario's brother told me he'd suffered, that he'd married young to fit in, that he'd made jokes at the table and cried on the porch. As we said goodbye, he placed the envelope in my hands as if returning a surname. I left, careful not to spill any of the past on the floor. I showed the letters to my mother first. She held the paper as if she held her own youth. There was no jealousy. There was mourning for a world that allowed no choice. My father stood, his eyes fixed on an old frame in the living room. I read aloud a note about the river. When I finished, he said he never learned to name what he felt without placing blame on it. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He didn't need to. I touched his shoulder and said I would learn to name it here while he was alive. The sentence opened a window in my home. The boys received the news of the letters with respectful curiosity. The oldest asked if he could read a passage. I chose a simple line and read it. He said he liked the way Mario wrote without flourishes. The youngest wanted to know if Grandpa would stop fighting the world. I replied that maybe he'd just change his fight, that now the fight was to soften without breaking. The child nodded as if he understood from within. At work, relocation became routine. I was assigned to a project with fewer storefronts and more local clients. A cell phone repair shop needed to organize its schedule and inventory. I sat next to the owner, a loud-mouthed man with fat fingers for a small keyboard. We adapted a simple system. In the end, he pulled me by the arm and showed me a photo of his son with his boyfriend. He told me to keep it a secret from the grumpiest customers, but that at home he had already learned not to lose people because of noise. I returned to the office with the feeling that the city, underground, already knows more than it lets on. With Helena, we continued fine-tuning. She asked me to let her know whenever Daniel was picking up the boys, so it wouldn't be a surprise on a bad day. We agreed to let each other know when a photo or comment circulated in the neighborhood, to shield the children with conversation before school caught up. With them, I found it hard having to come up with crisis plans for simple things, but real life requires a seatbelt, and seatbelts don't prevent breathing. One afternoon, I ran into my neighbor from 302 in the elevator. He was holding a cloth-covered pan. He said his wife had made cornmeal cake and had a piece left over. He asked about my father, Pedro's game, Mario's cards. I found myself recounting bits and pieces as if he were an old relative. He listened, scratched his chin, and said that every neighborhood has a bridge. The problem is that many people cross with their eyes closed. I laughed, I put the cake away, I shared it with Daniel. Simple things give you strength. Daniel and I continued practicing the light. At the market one Saturday, a young man commented loudly that it was showing off. Daniel took a deep breath and continued. I felt anger rise, but I remembered my pact with the therapist. I didn't teach a class. I didn't make a speech. I just walked, hand in hand. On the corner, a little boy smiled at us and showed us a drawing of two stick figures. The mother pulled her son by the arm and then came back just to whisper that she was trying to learn together. I replied that we were too. At home, we established our own peace inventory, a whiteboard on the wall to write down what works, dinner without cell phones at the table, one night a week to watch a silly movie, one afternoon a month to visit Daniel's mother, 2 Sunday lunches with my father and mother, and every 2 weeks a conversation with Helena about the week's changes. When a rule became too much, we adjusted it. It wasn't a guidebook for the ideal couple. It was a guidebook for people who want to stay together. Therapy brought a task that turned things around, writing a letter to myself from 10 years ago. I sat down in the wee hours of the morning and wrote it unadorned. I spoke of the fear that feeds on silence. I spoke of the courage that isn't a stage, but repetition. I spoke of Daniel, who is worth the routine, and of the father who will take time but will open the door. In the end, I asked myself not to wait for the perfect scene to start living. I read it aloud in the next session. I heard myself. I understood myself in a new way. The oldest's birthday arrived. We had a small party, pizza and soda. Helena organized the photos. I took care of the soundtrack, and Daniel stayed in the kitchen with my mother. My father arrived with a simple gift and a note for his grandson. May you have the courage I put off. The boy read it, looked at his grandfather, and hugged him without question. The room fell silent for a second that felt like a year. One rainy night, Mario's brother sent me one last message. He said he'd found a full, uncropped photo of his father and Mario by the river. He said he'd only give it to my father if he wanted to see it. I showed it to him carefully. My father asked for 2 days. On the 3rd, he knocked on my door. He came in, sat down, and said he was ready to look at the half of his life that had always been left out of the frame. We opened the photo at the table. He cried silently. I held his hand, and in that gesture, I felt the man who raised me finally breathing the exact size of his own chest. If you saw yourself at any point in this chapter, tell me in the comments with one word. It could be a bridge, it could be a breath of fresh air. This gesture shows me that this story helps you stand up. And if this video makes you feel good, please like and subscribe now. This way the message reaches those who still walk with their eyes closed over their own river. On Monday morning, I woke up to the house smelling of coffee and new courage, but the world doesn't change because I slept better. They changed my project at work. They removed my name from the display and put me in a smaller room with lackluster tasks. The manager smiled politely, spoke of readjustment and experience, those words that sound like wrapping paper. I signed what was there to sign and kept what was there to keep, my spine. I came home early to find Daniel putting together a crooked shelf. He glanced at me quickly, understood, and offered silence. He didn't lecture me. He gave me space. The shelf ended up level. So did I. That afternoon, I called Mario's brother. We agreed to meet at an old bakery, on a street where time still moves slowly. He arrived with a worn briefcase and eyes like someone who'd guarded the sun for many years. He handed me the letters and a small notebook. He said he didn't want them to die in a cardboard box. I leafed through them with warm hands. There were notes about fishing, laughter at the end of the bridge, plans for a life they never knew how to name. No forbidden words, and yet everything was said. I promised I'd take care. He nodded and, before leaving, touched my shoulder. Your father was a whole man, until the pieces were ripped away. Take this to him. On the way back, I sat on the sofa with Daniel and opened the notebook. There was a line at the beginning. When I laugh with you, the world comes together for a minute. I read it aloud. Daniel rested his head on my shoulder. We stayed like that for a while, each of us cradling what we could inside our chests. The next day I took the letters to my parents' house. I didn't tell them beforehand. My mother opened the door with her flour-stained apron and, when she saw the folder, called my father without saying his name. He came slowly, as if knowing the weight of a folder. I placed the notebook on the table. I said, "I brought history." He didn't touch it right away. He just brought his face closer, as if smelling a time. He opened it to the first page, read with his lips silently, and his hands, which had always been made of stone, trembled a thread. My mother pulled out a chair for me. I sat. My father closed the notebook, took a breath, and said softly, "I laughed too loudly on that bridge." Then, he laughed for real briefly, like someone testing their own body. We stood there, the three of us, giving a name back to what had always been just an initial. The boys continued with their routines and new questions. The oldest asked to go out with Daniel and me, just the three of us. We went to a neighborhood second-hand bookstore, the one that smelled of old pages and cheap promises. Daniel pointed to a photography book, and the boy opened it to a portrait of two people laughing on a random street and said, "I like it when you guys look like that." There was no judgment, just a desire for peace. We returned by subway, the aluminum seat cold, and I felt like a whole world fit into that car. Helena, for her part, began to draw an afterlife of her own. She found a therapist, rearranged her schedule, and went for a walk with a friend without explaining where she was coming from or going. One day, when I went to pick up the boys, she greeted me with her hair tied back in a new style and a slight glow. She said, "Today I cooked without counting the time." The sentence fit into two hands. I understood. Her house was learning a new tune, and I was happy to listen from afar. Not everything was serene. A cowardly note appeared at the entrance of my building. "Think of your children." The handwriting was from someone who had never signed anything. The doorman left it on my box without malice. I read it, folded it, and threw it away. The next day, the same box contained a small package of sweetbread from the bakery on the corner and a note written on notebook paper. "Think of them living with a whole father." Signed, 302. I knocked to thank him. The neighbor in the cap opened with his usual unceremonious smile. He said he didn't like injustice. I said neither. He offered coffee. I declined due to scheduling and accepted out of gratitude. Therapy continued to teach me to live with my body, not just with the idea. The psychologist made me practice something simple. Breathe while looking forward when someone crosses the street. I thought it was silly. It works. One day at the market, a boy whispered something I didn't want to understand. I looked at the oranges, then at Daniel, then at myself. I breathed. I bought 2 more bananas. Sometimes the truth is just that. 2 steps forward and a little fruit. At work, the whispers died down when they discovered I wasn't getting off. The elevator analyst invited me for a quick lunch and told me about her girlfriend. She said she was afraid of becoming a hallway conversationalist. I told her that fear doesn't go away, but it learns to walk alongside us. I returned to my desk eager to give my best, not to prove anything to anyone, but because my name deserves a decent job. On Saturdays, Pedro's game became a ritual. I'd bring water, a towel, and shout. The boy would look up at the stands and find me. Sometimes Helena would sit next to me. We'd talk about the school calendar, the youngest's allergy, the folder of letters that now slept at my house. There was no war there was grown-up work. After the game, a father in a formal uniform approached me, hesitant. I thought a beating was coming. He just said, "My brother is like you." I wasn't nice to him, thanks for staying. I nodded without a speech. Not every gesture demands a stage. Sundays took on a new meaning. I went to my parents' house again. I brought bread, 12 tomatoes, and Daniel. My father opened the door. He didn't ask him to stay behind the threshold. He simply said, "Coffee's ready." The 4 of us sat down, my mother circling the kitchen like someone conducting an orchestra. The topic of the day was soccer and the potted fern that needed more shade. At some point, my father asked Daniel about his mother. He told me about a Christmas with rain and a leaking roof on the table. My father laughed heartily. I heard that laughter like someone collecting rain in a dry cup. Late in the afternoon, I handed Mario's notebook to my father. I told him he could keep it for a week. He held it like someone welcoming a newborn. When we said goodbye, he took me aside and said, without looking, "That boy in the photo didn't leave out of embarrassment. He left because he liked you." The pronunciation of "you" sounded like a prayer. I understood he was talking about my children, about me, about Daniel, about everyone now at the table. I hugged my father. It wasn't a ceremony. It was a body. I know many. Dove, you listening to me now carry a notebook hidden deep within your chest. Stories no one read, gestures left on the bridge, names reduced to initials. If this crossing resonates with you, leave a comment. Write presence. I'll read it and remind you to stay standing. And if this story helps you breathe more freely, please like and subscribe now. It may seem small, but that's how our conversation reaches those who still live locked inside. That night, after dinner with the boys, I received a message from Mario's brother. He wanted to meet us again, this time with my father. He wrote that there was a photo missing from that envelope, a whole photo. I read it aloud. Daniel stopped in the bedroom doorway. He said nothing. I felt a slight tremor, the kind that announces a big wave, not to knock us down but to teach us a new rhythm. I breathed, replied, and slept, knowing that some stories push the walls of the house until they fit. I was ready to open another one. The meeting with Mario's brother happened on a low afternoon. I arrived with my father. He came slowly, but he came. The bakery smelled of old vanilla and cups that tell stories. Mario's brother was already waiting for us with an envelope larger than the last. He squeezed my father's hand tightly, and the two exchanged glances as if recognizing each other without needing a complete past. We sat down. He carefully opened the envelope and took out a photograph I'd never seen before. The same bridge, the same river, only now in one piece, uncut. The arm missing from my father's waist was there, and it was Mario's. Their smiles felt like wind. My father held the photo like someone holding water. He didn't cry. He simply said, "Here I still believed the world doesn't bite." My brother replied, "The world bites, but teeth aren't destiny." And he pushed the photo closer to me. "Take it. Your house now needs to receive what ours hid." We walked back in silence. At home, I placed the photo on the table next to the notebook. Daniel leaned against the doorframe, silent, with the respect he'd learned to practice so he could fit in without disappearing. My father stared at the image like someone learning a new word at 70. He called my mother, and she came in, drying her hands on her apron. She looked, nodded, and said, "I always knew there was half missing. I just didn't know the name." After a while, my mother brought coffee for everyone, including Daniel, and my father, without ceremony, asked what Daniel's mother was like. They chatted privately, no theory. I noticed that my parents' house was moving furniture quietly. The next day, Helena texted me, "I'm picking up the boys. I'll meet you at school." When I arrived, she had a new calm. On the way back, she told me she'd started a course on Saturday mornings. She said she wanted to learn how to grow shade and sun-loving plants. She smiled when she said this. I understood the message that wasn't a message. Each of us was discovering our own garden. At home, the boys saw the photo on the table. The oldest approached slowly, like someone entering an empty church, and said, "So Grandpa had a friend who held his waist without fear?" I said yes. He asked if Grandpa was going to be okay. I said, "He's going to be true. And the truth is scary, but it heals." The work, which seemed to have hidden me in a narrow room, began to breathe again when I stopped apologizing for breathing. I volunteered for a project no one wanted, an old system full of exposed wires. I spent nights redoing the map, writing explanations anyone could understand, training new people. The team saw it. Those same whispering voices now asked for help. The manager called me and said it would be good if I presented the results to the committee. He didn't ask me to hide. He just asked for results. I delivered. On the way out, the analyst who had thanked me in the elevator gave me a piece of paper with a crude drawing of two people holding a bridge. She stuck it on my desk. I stuck it to my chest. Even so, the neighborhood hadn't forgotten how to scratch. One morning, they spray-painted the building's gate with a tired insult. The doorman, guiltlessly embarrassed, told me as soon as it was light. Daniel and I went down with a bucket and paint. A neighbor offered a roller. Another brought bleach. Within half an hour, the wall had become a wall again. Someone had written in small print next to it, almost on the baseboard, "People live here." 302 winked from the window, thumb in the air. Fear tried to sit down but couldn't find a chair. My father, moved by some new impulse, invited me to walk through his old neighborhood. We went to the small bridge in our town, the bridge that isn't that bridge, but it is a bridge. He leaned against the railing, stared at the shallow water for a while and said, "I'm jealous of your time. A good jealousy. The time they let you live." I told him I wanted him with me during that time. He replied that he would try. We walked back slowly. At the door, he asked me for Mario's notebook again. He wanted to copy a sentence. Late in the afternoon, he sent me a photo, the dedication rewritten, but now with another line underneath, his handwriting, shaky and firm. I laughed with him too, and I can still laugh with you. One Wednesday night, the school organized a discussion group about living with differences. My oldest asked me to go. I went. I sat in the back, unwilling to be on stage. One boy said he'd change classes because of teasing. A mother said she'd learned not to laugh at jokes that make people shrink. When the moderator opened the class to anyone who wanted to speak, my voice ran out before my courage. I spoke of the invisible, of this exhausting task of fitting into a classroom where the chairs were bought for different body shapes. I didn't speak loudly. I spoke from close up. As I was leaving, a teacher put his hand on my shoulder and said that many things are better when someone decides to show up. I went home feeling light and heavy, as are the things that matter. Helena arrived one Sunday with a fern seedling in a bag. She said it was for my apartment because it still smelled of paint and new beginnings. Daniel smiled like someone just getting another piece of silverware. The fern sat in the window, catching the morning light. The house changed its sound. Later, Helena told me she might be meeting someone. She spoke without suspense, without asking for permission. I listened, felt a pang in my chest that wasn't jealousy or relief. It was just a passing of the guard. I told her I wanted her to be happy. She said, "I want that too." From then on, Sundays took on a new format. Sometimes I'd have lunch with my parents, sometimes with Helena's family, sometimes just me, Daniel, and the boys cooking pasta with a simple sauce and laughing at the splattering pulp on the stove. When I washed the dishes, I thought of Mario, writing about laughing, until the world sorted itself out for a minute. Now it was whole minutes. Not always, but increasingly. If you're listening and recognize a piece of your own in this journey, leave a comment. Write bridge. I read and understand that we continue to build a passage where for so long there was only a leap. And if this story helps you breathe differently, please like and subscribe now. This way, our conversation will reach those who still need a helping hand to cross. I'll be back next because there's more truth to share and I want to bring you along. The following week began with the hum of ordinary life. I woke up early, made coffee, arranged the fern Helena brought, and watched Daniel stir the pan like someone beating a drum to summon the morning. My phone vibrated with a message from my father. "Let's visit Mario City on Saturday." It wasn't a request. It was courage on the agenda. I said yes. He sent another short message. "I want to say my full name there." On Thursday, my oldest son asked Daniel to come watch the practice. I asked if he was sure. He said yes, that he was tired of dividing his heart's affairs into different schedules. We went. We sat discreetly in the stands. One father whispered, another pretended not to see, a mother waved bluntly. When practice ended, my son called Daniel's name in front of the coach and said, "This is the man my father loves." The coach shook his hand and talked tactics, as if someone's love were part of the warm-up. I saw there a world that learns slowly, but learns nonetheless. At work, I was truly reassigned. Less spotlight, more confidence. The old project with exposed wires became a clean slate, and the small team that agreed to come with me began to shine. I started doing something I'd never done before, giving credit out loud. Names spoken in meetings, names in emails, names on the whiteboard. Some people breathe easier when their own name sticks to what they've built. One day, the director came into the office and said that delivery smelled like a team. I smiled and pointed at them. I didn't mention myself. When she left, the elevator analyst tapped me on the shoulder and whispered, "It belongs." On Friday, the building assembly, the agenda began with the sound of an elevator motor and ended with the graffiti on the wall from 2 Sundays ago. I asked to speak, not to make a speech, but to propose clear rules of coexistence. Not a pretty poster, but something practical. Any offense in the common area would result in a Saturday cleaning party, with coffee and cheese bread for whoever did the cleaning. Half the people laughed, but no one dared vote against it. The neighbor with the hat said, "Hey, I'll bring the coffee." In the end, the union manager noted it in the minutes. I walked down the hallway feeling like a small muscle in the place had been flexed. On Saturday, my father and I hit the road early. Mario's town was 2 hours away, with stretches of sugarcane fields and cows that explode the eye. Horizon in white patches. We spoke little. Upon arrival, Mario's brother was waiting for us in the square with a cloth bag. He led us to the cemetery, under the shade of trees that seemed to hold the sound of old conversations. The three of us stood before a simple tombstone. My father took a deep breath, said Mario twice as if testing a bridge, and then said a third time in full voice. He told in short sentences what he hadn't had the courage to tell anyone. I didn't add anything. My brother left the bag on the ground. Inside were letters, 2 photographs and a notebook with recipes for sauces Mario liked to make. My father laughed at the recipes. He cried silently at the photos. Then he put his hand to the stone and said to it and to me, I was a coward, but I was also a survivor. I'm learning not to be just that. We returned to my parents' house with a new serenity, the kind that doesn't erase the marks, just stops scrubbing. My mother took out an old tablecloth and placed it on the table. She prepared chicken with farofa, a type of farofa. No one talked about anything big. We talked about school notes, about a pot that makes noise, about a cloud that looks like a dog. Finally, she brought a napkin sewn from a scrap of my father's old apron, embroidered with one word, laugh. He held the cloth with both hands and looked at me, at my mother, at the door where Daniel would enter the following Sunday. He didn't say thank you. He said, let's go ahead. On Sunday, the boys arrived for lunch with Daniel and I. We made pasta and tomato sauce. I let it burn a little and we laughed at the smell of a burnt party. The youngest asked if he could bring the entire photo of his grandpa to show at school when they studied memory. I hesitated for a second, then said yes, on the condition that he hold it with both hands, as if it were glass. He promised. We video called Helena and showed her the messy kitchen. She laughed and said that the plant course was teaching us that some species flourish in the shade. I replied that we were learning to do the opposite. On Monday, the street group came back with a photo of us at the market, this time with comments from people who still prefer the audience to the meeting. Before I could think of a response, the union member wrote, "Subject closed, the rule here is respect." She locked the thread. It wasn't a war one. It was just one person saying they wouldn't waste their breath on the same poison anymore. Sometimes that's enough to clear the air. Midweek, I received an email from the previous manager, inviting me to coach a new group arriving next month. I was surprised. He wrote that he'd understood that you don't lose a team by telling the truth, you lose it by lying. I accepted. In the first class, instead of starting with technical details, we started with social agreements. I said very little. I asked each person to name one thing the team could do so no one would have to pretend they weren't who they were. The list turned out well and practical. Don't laugh at jokes that cringe, give credit out loud, ask questions before assuming. I took this list home and stuck it on the fridge. The fridge became a reminder board of how to walk. My father made an appointment with a therapist for men his age. He called me on the way out and said the woman had asked him what he wanted to leave as a legacy for his grandchildren. He replied that he wanted to leave courage without trumpeting and tenderness without shame. I told him that was a lot. He replied that it was little compared to the time lost. The following Sunday, when Daniel entered my parents' house, my father called him by name without holding back and asked him to try the farofa. Daniel tried it and said it felt like a childhood Sunday. My father smiled from the corner. My mother wordlessly placed the embroidered napkin on Daniel's lap. Things were arranged with gestures that fit in the palm of a hand. There was also a stumble. One afternoon, I ran into my former colleague who loved to brag in the work cafeteria. He made a cheap joke, the kind that tries to reduce people to a crooked frame. I didn't make a speech. I calmly said, "Not here." He laughed awkwardly and left. A new analyst overheard and texted me later, "Thank you for cutting without a knife." I kept the phrase, cutting without a knife. Maybe that's what we learn when we decide to exist in plain sight without a fight that turns into a show. Now, at the end of this path that hasn't yet ended, I look at the table and see 3 objects: the full-length photo of my father and Mario, the notebook with the word truth that started it all, and the team roster taped to the fridge. Each of them is a kind of light. Small, but insistent. I continue writing my life with Daniel by my side, with Helena discovering her own garden, with the boys learning that love doesn't tear down a house, it just moves some walls around. If this story reached you and opened a centimeter of air within you, write Presenza in the comments. I'll read it and follow along. Confirm your like and subscribe now, because it will make this conversation reach those who still carry silence like heavy armor. I'll continue in the sequence to close what needs to be closed, with full step. On Monday morning, I woke before the clock. The kitchen smelled of coffee and Sunday pasta still lingering in the pans. Daniel was cutting fruit like someone tuning an instrument. I opened the window and let the street flood in. I thought about what had already been said, what still needed to be held upright, and felt my body occupy its proper place in a new way. My phone vibrated with a message from the principal. The group I trained did well on their first delivery. Congratulations on the atmosphere you created. I smiled to myself because the sentence spoke of the work, but also of everything else. Atmosphere is what we sow in the air when we stop apologizing for existing. On Wednesday, Helena showed up with 2 grocery boxes, one for me, one for her. In one, tomatoes and notebooks, in the other, books and seedlings. We distributed things on the floor while planning holidays, dentist appointments, and school anniversary celebrations. No one feigned enthusiasm, but there was care. When she left on the table a potted plant with a hardy one, the kind that survives neglect and overcare. She said, "It's good to have greenery that can handle a lot." Understood the dedication hidden in her words. I replied, "Thanks for holding on where I couldn't." She nodded. There was no victory there. There was cooperation. On Saturday, I returned with my father to the river in Mario's city, not to look back, but to align the column of the present. We brought flowers without ribbons and a bottle of ice-cold water. We sat on a stone block and remained silent for as long as the water required. My father said Mario's full name, and this time his voice didn't falter. Then he looked at me and said, with a precision rare for him, "I saw you." The 4 words touched my chest like a warm hand. I didn't need an apology nor a blessing. I needed those 4 words. When we stood, my father took a small piece of paper from his pocket and handed it to me. It was a list of things he wanted to learn little by little, to say good morning without stiffening, to ask questions without guarding, to laugh without guarding the door. I kept it in my notebook. It was a pact between men from different times. Sunday, a big lunch. Helena brought the boys and her mother. My mother came with sweets and stories. My father laid out the checkered tablecloth that always resisted change. Daniel stood at the makeshift grill, grilling sausages with a seriousness that made me laugh. The conversation was quiet but thorough. The oldest asked Daniel to watch the science presentation the following week. The youngest showed a drawing of the family. Me, Helena, him, his brother, his grandfather in a hat, his grandmother in an apron, and a bearded man beside me holding a small plant. He stuck the sheet to the fridge with 2 crooked magnets. No one made a speech. The world moves on when children's art comes before adult ideology. On Monday, I brought to the team the idea of opening meetings with a quick overview of how everyone arrived. 2 practical sentences. Today I slept well. Today I woke up worried. Today I need to leave early. And the combination of cover, who, can handle such a task. The work became more human without becoming less demanding. At the end of the day, one of the boys on the team came to say that for the first time, he felt like a person on the time card. I jotted this sentence down on the page of my notebook that keeps phrases worth the cost of continuing. At school, the science presentation was in the playground. The sound failed, the poster flew, and my son took 2 deep breaths before following the explanation as if he'd practiced the wind. I clapped with one hand on my chest and the other outside. At the end, he came running and asked me if I'd heard the part about the gears. I said yes, that the best part was watching something turn without pushing it with my hand. He smiled wider than the playground. The soccer coach walked by and said, "See you Saturday." Life, when it wants to, puts simple sentences in just the right place. The building assembly complied with the new rule for the first time. An ugly phrase appeared in the elevator. There was no long text. There was a bucket, soap and cheese bread at the entrance. The person who wrote it didn't introduce themselves, but they cleaned it up. I saw a piece of the world being scrubbed with the palm of their hand. The neighbor with the cap brought strong coffee. The union manager put away the rag and said, "Let's not build a monument to offend. Let's clean it up." I thought that maybe this is the philosophy that works for many things. Between one scene and another, stumbles arose. There was a night when I woke up startled by old nightmares. There was a day when Daniel arrived tired of keeping the mood in the room with people who think everything they don't understand is just a show. In these moments, we learn to repeat some pocket anchors. I say, "I'm here." He says, "Me too." The right phrase at the right moment is like an umbrella in a storm. Therapy taught me to recognize the trigger and walk with it without giving up direction. It takes time, but it happens. My dad now sometimes texts me early in the morning with pictures of plants. He asks the name, gets it wrong, gets it right, laughs. One day he wrote, "Does Daniel know how to make farofa de giblets?" I replied yes, and that each giblet becomes a memory if stirred patiently in the pan. He responded with a curt "okay," but the following week he showed up with a bag of bread and 2 lemons. That's his way of saying, "Come." Helena told me she gave an open lecture in the plant course about species that tolerate wind. The room filled up. At the end, a student asked how she managed to avoid breaking down. Helena said that no one is immune, but that the truth takes deep root. I heard this over the hallway speakerphone and thought, we didn't become friends, we didn't become enemies, we became family in a different form, and that's a title that doesn't need a certificate. Saturday of the neighborhood market arrived. Daniel and I went hand in hand, not letting go of each other in fear. We bought bread, fruit, and a new notebook. A lady stopped me to say she'd read the photo in the group and didn't need to comment, but she wanted to point out that there are still people who care more about trash on the sidewalk than about their loved ones. I thanked her, bought more bread, and saved these little gifts like someone saving coins for emergencies. On the way home, I opened the new notebook. On the first page, I wrote the phrases that sustain me. A lie shrinks you until it fits in a jacket pocket. The truth gives you posture. Love doesn't tear down a house, it just moves a plant. A child listens to what you do more than what you say. And the last one, inherited from Mario's note. When we laugh together, the world shrinks its edges. I read it aloud. Daniel at the sink added, and when we laugh at ourselves, the world learns where it doesn't hurt. If you've walked with me this far, comment entirely. I read and remember every word. Like and subscribe now, because it helps this conversation find those who still live cowering behind the curtain. Here I continue to bring stories that transform silence into breath and fear into steps. We've reached the end.